Okay. So welcome to Mercedes Trigos. Here, an assistant professor at UCI in the Department of English. Thank you very much for taking the time and being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's very a pleasure. So let's start from the basic. Tell us what your path has been so far. What brought you to your research interest? There was an eureka moment. Have you always known that you wanted to research this? And then how everything evolved to get you here with us today at UCI?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'm definitely one of those people who thinks, everything that you go through kind of leads you to the place where you're at. So I think I had always had an interest in race, and that's kind of racialization in general in my undergrad, but I wasn't as aware that that's what it was. I just kind of liked particular types of literature or more sort of dramatic types of plots. And then sort of slowly, and especially coming to the PhD program, that's where I realized what the investment was. I've always been interested in questions of desire as well, and sort of the connection with death, and not so much from like a psychoanalytical perspective, but more from an erotics perspective. I think, so I can think of one text that, especially for the current project, for my, book project now, was really important, and that's Eugenia by Eduardo Sáez. So I actually read that novel for a course in my PhD program, and it was the second year. And this is a novel that is written by a Cuban Yucatecan doctor who kind of thinks that he wants to do this experiment, and he writes this novel. I definitely recommend that novel. It's a little bit wild, but it's kind of having it's reappearing in criticism in ways that I think are really interesting. But one of the things that happens, and it sort of portrays this eugenic society in the future, what he imagines it could look like. And when it starts, the first, or one of the first scenes is the Ernesto, who's the main character, who comes out of the shower and he's looking at himself in the mirror. And the narrative gaze kind of follows the lines, right? So he follows the lines of his body, and there's this kind of like homoerotic look at the male body that is very eugenically beautiful, right? So it starts noticing the muscles, where they go, and he kind of looks like a Greek figure, and where he has hair, and the fact that he has no superfluous hair, there's like extremely detailed. And to me, that was, I always think about that moment, and I always talk about that moment, because it's very evident that what's happening is that eugenic principles are getting eroticized through a particular kind of body that is portrayed as a eugenically beautiful, perfect, quote unquote, perfectly fit body. And that's kind of, even though that novel, I'm not sure if it's going to be in the book project, that's kind of what started the process. And eugenics, in some ways, allowed me to bring together all of those concerns that I had before about racialization, but also about our notions of what makes a healthy body, right? A fit body, abled versus a disabled body. So it kind of, that text, I think, pulled together all of those interests and led me to the project that I'm working on now. And I think, teaching-wise, I was a high school teacher for a while before getting the PhD. And I was always kind of skills. I learned to teach focusing on skills as opposed to content. And I very much still teach that way, and I think that way. So my classes, undergrad and grad level, emphasize skills as opposed to just people knowing a lot about a particular topic, which is, it maybe happens, but it's not kind of the purpose. And I think about that. I think I've come to understand it also in terms, with the help of a mentor in grad school, as one way in which we can also reject sort of these narratives of mastery of knowledge within academia. So I think those are really important moments to me that kind of mark, my approach to teaching, and also, I guess, moments that have sparked research projects.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned teaching, because that leads also to my second question. I know you work a lot with the archive, but what's also special is that you bring the archive to the classroom, or actually the opposite, right? You bring the classroom to the archive. What is that? What do you think the students gain from this contact with the archive, and what have you learned in working with the archive?
Yeah, well, to me, it's my favorite part of my job is going to the archive. So in a very sort of immediate way, I hope that the students find the joy that I found. And that's kind of, that's one answer. But I think in a different way, in a more theoretical way, especially within literature, we are so used to talking about the archive, right? Or like, my archive is this, my archive is that. But there's a way in which sometimes those questions or those focus on the archive as a metaphor or as a metaphorical place actually leaves out the very practical and real sort of concrete ways in which there are archives, right? So there's actual buildings that you go into, and there's a whole bunch of practices and a whole bunch of processes through which those documents get to the point where we can, quote unquote, like consult them, right? So one major thing is sort of helping students think about the archive as a place, cataloging structures, what kind of documents are deemed important, what collections are processed, what collections are, I guess that libraries will take versus not, like how much they pay for them, who donates them. All of that I feel is fascinating, and it's a crucial part of the actual research that we're able to do afterwards, right? But I think if we stay in the idea of the metaphor, you lose the very real processes that people and the actual people who are doing all the work of archiving and, like recovering all of the different materials. And then I think lastly too, when you are in the archives, you can also, or that also allows a kind of conversation about disciplinary conventions. So if you think about the literary purposes of, or not the literary purposes, but I guess the method through which a literary scholar can go into the archive and say, okay, I'm going to use this one paper to write an argument about X, Y, and Z, versus a historian, that's not how it works at all, right? So for a historian, one paper might be useless, in some ways. And I always think about one of my mentors in my PhD program who was trained as a historian and was always saying, this is for him as a historian, people would always say, like, that's great, you found something that's lovely, now find me another 100 cases, because otherwise this is not something that you can actually build an argument around. And I think it's important for students, especially graduate students, to see those disciplinary conventions so that they can also understand how they're structuring their own arguments, and how we all kind of do that as scholars, right? Like, what are your biases? Where are you coming from? What's your training? And the kind of analyses that allows versus different kinds of training or different kinds of entry points to the same documents or the same set of documents.
Makes sense. And sorry if I insist on this, but it really caught my attention. It's fascinating that you said the joy I discovered, right, going to the archive. And it's curious because for a lot of people, I will even dare to say most people, is kind of daunting, right? It's like the infinite library of Borges, no? Sometimes they feel like there is no end. So could you describe the joy experience? Where is it that you find the joy in the archive?
Yeah. I mean, okay, I think I will caveat by saying that I don't think that having joy negates the fact that it's daunting. I also do think it's daunting. I guess, let me try to think of an example. I think this might sound like I'm romanticizing it, because there are actual, you spend hours going through documents and seeing all of these documents that you are like, oh, they might be useful, but then they end up not really being useful, or they're not exactly what you wanted. But I think there are moments of, like, the aha moment that sometimes people talk about for writing. I have those too for, you find an archival document, you're like, here it is. This is what it is. This is what I've been looking for. And there's, I think, like, Arlette Farge calls it like the allure of the archives, that there's this kind of like pull that we have for the, I mean, I'm maybe doing a disservice to this argument because it's much more complicated, but that there's a pull to what we think the archives can do for us. And I find those fantasies that we have of coherence and like what we actually feel is accessible, just fascinating to me. So I like that. And I do kind of like, in a cheesy way, just sitting down and, you know, the ones that make you put gloves on and you're looking around or you find something random. Like I found for Size, for example, he's so, this is the same person who wrote, you know, any of the text I mentioned earlier, but his presence is all over Merida because he was in the government and he was a doctor. So there's very different repositories that have documents related to him. And I found this lawsuit against him because I guess he was a horrible tenant. And that, to me, is amazing, right? It gives you a different view of the writer that you maybe wouldn't get. So yeah, I think that's part of it.
Makes sense. It looks like you like to complicate things, right? Is it like
yes? Unfortunately, I do love it. That's everything is like the nuances to me.
And it's interesting because it's the same you do in your research with eugenics, right? That is very often just simply framed like a pseudoscience of racial purification, right? But you complicate this concept. So could you explain us how you see this eugenic discourse in your research?
Yeah. So to me, so I think, you know, like I'm thinking of eugenic discourse basically as like the way that people talk about eugenic ideas, right? And I'm interested in it. I think there's a lot of research in eugenics that when you that is actually pretty broad, right? So to think about eugenics, part of the thing that to me, you know, in my book that's called, you know, or my current book project, that's, you know, eugenic seductions, is actually thinking about how seductive that language of eugenics is. And it's part of the seduction comes from the beginning of the 20th century, that discourse, in some ways, it kind of fits whatever you want it to fit, right? Like, and that's what makes it so dangerous, but also so prevalent, because it's not only about race, it's also about morality, it's also about intelligence, it's also about, you know, notions of beauty, notions of just kind of how they all interact. So it is, I would say, it is absolutely a discourse of race and of racial purification. But if I say racial purification, that also means it looks different from a United States perspective, where that race purity is more legible as, okay, you're either white, you're black, you know, if we're thinking of a national narrative that is operating under a black-white narrative, or a white-black binary, excuse me. But if you think about it in the Mexican context and in different countries of Latin America that have mixture as the basis for that national racial narrative, right? So to think about mestizaje, it's actually not necessarily about who's pure, quote unquote, but it's about what kind of mixture will get you the quote unquote fittest individual. So I think to think, and again, you know, I guess for your original question about the discourse of eugenics, I think to look at the discourse, to me, and moving a little bit away of, a little bit, but I also use some of the medical and sort of historical documents, and to look at cultural product means that you're also looking at these sort of invisibilized logics of racism that continue to very much dictate the way that we read racial codes. But they're not, because they're not labeled as eugenics, because after the second half of the 20th century, that gets like a bad reputation for saying that word, and arguably that is still the case now, but that doesn't mean that the actual ideas were not continuing. So I guess I'm really interested in thinking about, in tracing, or finding a way to trace how those ideas continue to affect the way that we think today, or even our constructions of racial bodies, you know, what is a racialized body, et cetera.
And it looks like you're doing a lot of interesting job in that in that area. And let me read, because I don't want to butcher this, because I don't want to make a disservice to your article, but an erotics of eugenics article was an honorable mention for the Outstanding Article Award in the Latinx Studies section for the Latin American Studies Association in 2023. Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
So you explore a lot of the things you were explaining right now to us about eugenics, and there is a lot of stress in the how these discourses changed in different languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted you to explain us how that work, how that research work, what did spark that research and that article, what were your most important findings, how did that help you to frame this eugenics discourse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that article, it was it was a chapter from my dissertation, and the way that I started, right, is I was thinking about the novel. A lot of it has to do with, or it's based on Leonor Villegas de Magnon, as you know. Excuse me. And she wrote this novel that's called La Rebelde, and it's originally written in Spanish. It's sort of like a historical take on her presence and her sort of work for the Mexican Revolution, and she was working from both sides, right, from the U.S. and Mexico. So that's kind of the transporter part of that. That seems really important to me. But you read the Spanish version, and there's a moment of, which I argue is the moment where her feminist consciousness is developing, where she becomes La Rebelde, or the rebel. And she is traveling with her family across the borderlands, and the family encounters a group of Comanche Indians, right? And I'm using that word also for the purposes of the, sort of discourse in that sense. But as a little girl, the father sort of gets distracted, and the next thing he knows is the girl is all the way over there, and the Spanish version is she's like fascinated by this figure, right? So she's kind of like touching his beads and doing all of this thing, it's very eroticized language, and it's sort of this encounter where she realizes that she's a rebel by encountering this figure and sort of having an erotic sort of connection to whatever she's construing as this like racialized Comanche Indian, right? And there's a moment in the Spanish version where the Indian figure kisses the rosary, and it's this kind of weird ode to Catholicism in some ways. The self-translation of that novel, which happens 40 years later when she's here, and it's sort of supposedly written for an Anglo audience as opposed to the Mexican audience. Instead of having a full page, that's basically, it's like 3 lines. And it was something, I'm paraphrasing, but the language is basically like, she got close to him, touched the beads, and he was pleased. And I think I read that moment and I was like, wait, something is happening in between those years. And I think that's why I think those ideologies are negotiated in translation, right? And in movement, because something is happening with her conception of racialization and how important that is for the formation of her feminist consciousness that is different in the Spanish version, the 40 years before. It's like about 40 years before, imagined for a Mexican reader versus the much later sort of Anglo imagining and the national narrative, within the national narrative of the U.S. and the place of the indigenous figure in Mexico and in the U.S. So that was, I think, in terms of the transporter sort of like erotics, that's part of it. And then the second part, which is the archive, when I went to the University of Houston and to see Special Collections has her papers, and as I was going through them, I found a short story, and this is one of those aha moments. And it was one of the first chapters that I wrote also. But it was one of those moments where I opened it and I saw the short story that's called Lingerie, Lingerie, Lingerie. And something inside of me was like, that's it. That's where she's gonna be writing, I guess, or the fact that I guess I got maybe confirmation. I don't know if that's problematic in some ways to say it, but I got sort of confirmation that there is something that she was interested in terms of eroticization. And it, comparing or thinking about that short story in conjunction with the text gave me a methodology for the project later on, which is something that I'm really interested in, is to think about our categories of authors, right? The information that is accessible for us, and what we can do with that, and how that becomes almost like a fossilized idea of this author thinks X, and what happens when you have access to other kinds of documents that maybe hadn't been as readily accessible for whatever reason, how those might change our ideas of that or complicate our ideas of authors and sort of like either the coherence of the way that they write or their investments or how they complement, I guess, different versions of, in this case, what her feminism might look like.
And it's very interesting also because it looks like you're pointing to the idea of not just rereading everything in a feminist key or just saving some authors because they're showing that early feminist attitude, but maybe also make sure we can frame them right and we can see these movements, in this case eugenics, right, and how she's using this kind of language. So what are you trying to tell us with this? Where are we trying to go? Like, shouldn't we be reading those authors? Should we be reading them through a different lens? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think, so to me, one of the main things that I am looking to contribute, with my work is within Latinx studies, there is the recovery project that's called that's the short name for it, but it's the Recovering the U.S. Literary Heritage, the Hispanic Literary Heritage. Sorry, I butcher that name a lot. But that's a project that has done sort of phenomenal work with Arte Público Press in terms of recovering a lot of works, so Spanish language newspapers and short stories and novels and different kinds of things that had been in obscurity for years, right? And within Latinx studies, when we think about the field, the formation of the field happens mostly like after the 1960s, right? And it's after this moment where Chicano, we're thinking of it as a name of resistance. This is coming from, abuses to civil rights. And so there's a tendency to assume that not only, I guess not to assume, but I guess I am interested in thinking about complicating what resistance might mean, right? Because there's a way in which post-1960s, that kind of resistance towards the government is more legible in ways that some of the pre-1960s works of people who we want to consider this is like Latinx literature, right? Or as we're building that portion of the field are not so, I guess the crude way of saying it is they're not necessarily people that you want to root for their beliefs, in some ways. Partly, in this case, because of the eugenic sort of connection. And I should clarify too that it's not, what's weird about them or what's rare about them is not that they have these eugenic ideas, because they were so popular, right? So everybody had some version of a eugenic idea that was guiding their thought. But I think to not, in thinking about recovering these texts, I think one of the main things that I am concerned with or that I'm thinking about is how we recover them. Not so much that we are recovering them, but how are we thinking about these texts and what is actually their place in, if we're thinking of a genealogy of Latinx writers, right, or feminists, just looking at nuances and not necessarily just looking for a narrative of resistance, which might be the one that, for good reason, we're the most comfortable with.
Makes totally sense. And let me go back. You mentioned already your new book on the works, eugenics seduction, right?
It's in the works. It's not yet being written as we
Exactly.
speak.
In the forge.
Yes.
So, what I would like for you to start talking maybe on what drove you to choose that title, because I love it. I think where you were speaking about the archive, it made me think about this title, like that allure. It allures you, but it's also, it gives you an idea, knowing your work, where you may be going, but it opens up a lot of possible doors, a lot of possible readings. So, would you mind talking us a little bit about the title of the in the works book?
Yeah. I love that question. I'm really excited about the title. So this is a book that is based on my dissertation. And my dissertation was eugenic erotics. So you can also see it in that article that you mentioned, right? It's like an erotics of eugenics. And thinking about erotics was, I think, very helpful in the moment, right, when I was writing. But I think the move towards eugenic seductions as opposed to erotics is expanding that framework of desire, right? So there's a lot of ways in which the discourse, the seduction of eugenics is that if you hear it, it actually sounds amazing. Like you can actually see how the language of eugenics was so popular, because in some ways it's like, who doesn't want a world without disease, right? Who doesn't want a world without poverty? Who doesn't, like, if you think about it that way, as a way of trying to assuage the pain, it makes total sense. And that's why it's so seductive, and not necessarily in practice. Once you see that that's actually the way to get there, is riddled with problems. It's riddled with really horrible treatment of people. Then that gets more complicated. But so I guess thinking about the title, right? Like one of them is the seduction of the actual eugenic rhetoric, right? And why it might continue to sort of like reappear in ways in current, in different sort of like political discourses, et cetera, but kind of that seduction that continues. But I also think part of the seduction is in the framework of these writers, right? So that thinking about the body or writing about the body in a way that is seductive to begin with. It's like the again, to put it crudely, but it's the sexy body is the eugenic body. And how do I eroticize a body that I am specifically saying is eugenically fit and eugenically ideal? When those get linked, that's also part of the seduction that I'm interested in. And that's something that happens through language in literature, of course, but I think also through sort of patterns, right? Like ways in which we learn how to read bodies, things that we're looking for in particular bodies, an over-reliance on sort of like, or like an ocular centrism for different kinds of legibility. So I think those are some of the ways I think that I'm thinking about seduction in a way that is much broader than the erotics framework that I had in my dissertation.
That is fascinating, and I love how you work with that title. It's incredible. So I commend you.
Thank you.
And about that, so correct me if I'm wrong. This book, it promises also to fit feminism in this discourse. Can you give us a little peek on how that's going to look like?
Well, so I'm interested, I think for practical purposes, obviously, like to think about eugenics discourse in general is incredibly broad. So what I'm interested in the most is how feminist writers from the 20th century were using eugenic discourse to move feminist agendas, right? So sometimes that looks like people who are actually arguing for policy changes, and sometimes it just looks like people who are thinking about racial betterment or advancements within Mexican American communities in the U.S. or within sort of elite circles in Mexico. So that's kind of how feminism comes into play. And it's interesting because feminism is also a discourse of resistance, right? So to think about the ways in which it can be resisting some things and then also be complicit with other hegemonic projects. So that's kind of the peak. I think my book is trying to do a kind of it's a different version of white feminism. So it's white feminism, but from Latin America, or what it can look like.
Okay, very interesting. And how does this project complicate more the celebratory or linear narratives of Latinx or Mexican feminism, right? What discomforts, what critical thinking does this create?
Yeah. So one of them is kind of like I said, we have this, and I also get why, I'm in this language obviously of desire because I'm always thinking about this, but I do get the seduction, right? Of we want to be able to say, Latinos and Latinxes were here prior to 1960s. And it's so important to recognize that that's the case. But I think in that moment, something that I feel like we should resist is to think that it would mean the same thing to be, a Latino at various points of history, right? So that's one of the aspects. I also think I'm very much aligned with the scholars who see Latinidad as like a multiracial, ethnic, designation. And in that sense, I think it breaks our celebratory notions of, okay, so because, people are Latinos because people are involved in political struggles, that means that they're progressive. That means that they are, because they're feminist, that means that they want, the best for X, Y, and Z, or they want to push this particular agenda. And I'm thinking specifically about whiteness within these like narratives of Latinidad so that we can trace, I think, some of the ways in which race is sort of sometimes, not always, but sometimes not, I guess, dealt with in a more sort of nuanced way, right? That it would be different for a writer to be white in the beginning of the 20th century versus black. And that's not to say that there's a legal designation, right, of Mexican at the time of Mexican as white, but I think it's just that there's more complicated ways in which race is getting articulated throughout the century that is not legible when we just use a label like Latino. Not immediately legible.
Makes
always.
Sense. And do you think, I want to make sure this question is not too abstract, do you think these works that the feminist movements do, especially when we're talking about Chicano or excuse me, Chicanx or Mexican, right, literature, how much of this discourse, of these narratives do you think is to try to like empower themselves, but at the same time making sure there is still someone to point the finger at? I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and then let me answer, and then if it isn't, you can you can ask me again. I think what's sneaky is that and this is like, the fight for progress sometimes obscures how much our brains and our structures are extremely hierarchical, right? So to imagine that progress I think the concept of progress might mean progress for some, not progress for all, is something that like critics have pointed out for years, but that maybe wasn't as mainstream as it is now. But I do think that it's easy, right, to sort of feel like, well, this is so, we need this, so let's focus on it, and this is great. And it's easy to focus on one thing and ignore all of the, all of the negative things that can come out of it. And obviously I'm biased because eugenics, I think, is one of those examples, right? That it promises something that one is not actually delivering, right? But that it's building on this fantasy of progress in here means that there's not negative consequences for particular people, right? It's only like focusing on the positive side, or the quote unquote positive, because I'm not sure that I would call that positive either way. But I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think in a capitalistic way, instead of positive, we could say the gains, right? The gains of
Yeah.
specific category, right? Or the specific goals.
Yeah, I like that. Who benefits?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking to us. Last question, though.
Okay.
Is a curveball. So I hope you're ready. Okay, is the
I
hard
hope so
question.
too.
Is the hard question. Now I really want to read the book. When it's coming out? When it's going to be ready, more or less?
Well, if all goes well, maybe in 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have to wait.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will email you for some advices to readings in the meantime then.
Of course, yeah.
Well,
and I'm flattered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today, for your wonderful talk, and congratulations. It's really an amazing research.
Thank you.
We're very fortunate to have you here at UCI.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes.
All right. Thank you.